On Ash Wednesday and the day after this year, a group of us sponsored a conference entitled Healing Harm, Restorative Justice, and the Abuse Crisis in the Catholic Church. The purpose of the conference was to introduce the idea of restorative justice here in our diocese, and we invited experts on the use of restorative justice and restorative practice from the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis.
People, you look at restorative justice when there's been harm. So whether it's a criminal case or whether it's harm of betrayal by a friend or betrayal by a church, or whether it's a dispute between people, there's harm. And I often tell people the only difference between crime and harm is that a legislature has decided to enact criminal laws for it. So, for example, if somebody steals a lawn chair off of your lawn, that's a crime. If your spouse betrays you with somebody else, it's not a crime. But the harm, you can see, is much greater in one than the other. So when we're looking at restorative justice, whether it's a crime or not, we can apply this process to both. That's why we apply it to bullying in the schools, and there's a lot of use in the schools. So we're looking at harm. It is not a process to figure out who did what. It's not a trial. It's not to prove somebody guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's to address the harm.
Now, regarding these type of events, there are more than a few Catholics who say, why are they stirring the pot? Why can't we just move on, right? You hear that a lot. Folks, with trauma, whether it's direct or secondary, that's not how it works. We've all seen that. Its effects remain unless and until the pain is acknowledged and the process, as Janine talks about, begins toward healing, right? The process, because it's lifelong. But the Spirit of God is not a spirit of denial. Think of the Old Testament prophets, right? They named the harm in an effort to move those who had sinned to repentance and back to fidelity with God and neighbor. This is also consistent with what occurs in the sacrament of reconciliation, certainly what marks this season of Lent that we have begun. Now, the harm of the twin crises of clergy abuse and cover-up has been manifold and deep. First, victim survivors of clergy abuse, their lives forever changed as they labor with the deep hurt and attendant scars of this unfathomable violation. Father Ron Rolheiser, some of you know him and his writing, he calls this the worst kind of trauma. He refers to this as soul death. And then, as Justice Geske points out, when they came forward to speak of their abuse, they were often blamed or not believed and left wounded on the side of the road. Now, one of the challenging dimensions of restorative justice is it is hard to restore without accountability. So we talk about acute places of harm and ground zero. It's here in Wheeling. I was thinking about, as we were preparing for this night, you have had the trifecta. No, and I don't say that in a way that is being glib. You've had financial malfeasance with regard to your former bishop. The abuse or sexual harassment of vulnerable, either seminarians or others, and then corruption in terms of payments and this and that, deep harm. It is so good that you're here. What an act of faith, right? God is in the midst of that, but the harm is acute, and it's important to acknowledge that.
Primarily, keeping victim survivors first is what we always lead with. But what struck me was the peripheral harm. The people in the circles that talked about how hard it was to defend their faith, how sad in the sense of loss they felt, family members that had left. What else could have happened with that money? How could they have been lied to like that? When I hear people say, this is old stuff, we don't really need to be worried about this anymore, and I look at the people, particularly in the circles that have experienced trauma, this is the heart of pastoral care. I mean, this is really taking care of each other and being there for each other in a way that we're called to do.
We're going to talk about the church because I am a practicing Catholic, and I have to tell you that I was doing this work for many years when I'm thinking, I'm hearing people in the pews say, well, why don't these victims just get over it? You know, it's 40 years ago, the priest is dead, you know, they're taking all this money, it's destroying our church, there's not money for social justice. And I knew, because I've learned from working with so many survivors, particularly of sexual assault, that if people could see and hear victims, they wouldn't say that. You would never say that, because you hear the pain in their voice, and you hear what happened, and you hear how their family reacted, and you hear how the ripples ripped through their lives until many of them are older and they still have it as a part of their life.
So what's next? What we're hoping is that those who participated in the conference will spend some time reflecting on what they learned and to see where we could use restorative justice and restorative practices in different places in the diocese to begin to identify the harms and work toward healing them that were created by the abuse of power from our former Bishop, Michael Bransfield.